Swissair Flight 111 was a Swissair McDonnell Douglas MD-11 on a scheduled airline flight from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, United States to Cointrin International Airport in Geneva, Switzerland. This flight was also a codeshare flight with Delta Airlines. On Wednesday, 2 September 1998, the aircraft used for the flight, registered HB-IWF, crashed into the Atlantic Ocean southwest of Halifax International Airport at the entrance to St. Margarets Bay, Nova Scotia. The crash site was 8 kilometres from shore, roughly equidistant from the tiny fishing and tourist communities of Peggys Cove and Bayswater. All 229 people on board died, the highest death toll of any aviation accident involving a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 and the second highest of any air disaster to occur in Canada, after Arrow Air Flight 1285. The initial search and rescue response, crash recovery operation, and resulting investigation by the Government of Canada took over 4 years and cost 57 million Canadian dollars. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada's official report of their investigation stated that flammable material used in the aircraft's structure allowed a fire to spread beyond the control of the crew, resulting in a loss of control and the crash of the aircraft. Swissair Flight 111 was known as the UN Shuttle due to its popularity with United Nations officials. The flight often carried business executives, scientists, and researchers. History, aircraft. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, serial number 48448 registered HB-IWF, was manufactured in 1991 and Swissair was its only operator. It bore the title Award, in honor of the Swiss canton of the same name. The airframe had a total of 36,041 hours. The three engines were Pratt & Whitney 4462s. The cabin was configured with 241 seats. First and business class seats were equipped with an in-seat in-flight entertainment system, installed at some point after initial entry into service. Crew: an MD-11 has a standard flight crew consisting of a captain and a first officer, as well as a cabin crew made up of a more registered trademarked cabine supervising the work of 11 flight attendants. All personnel on board Swissair Flight 111 were qualified, certified, and trained in accordance with Swiss regulations under the Joint Aviation Authorities. The cockpit crew consisted of 50-year-old Captain Urs Zimmermann and 36-year-old First Officer Stefan Laparagraph W., both experienced pilots with 10,800 flight hours and 4,800 flight hours, respectively. The captain was also an instructor pilot for the MD-11. Flight and crash: the flight took off from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport at 2018 Eastern Daylight Time. From 2033 EDT until 2047 EDT, the aircraft experienced an unexplained 13-minute radio blackout. The cause of the blackout was determined to be an error in the tuning of the communication radios. At 22:10 Atlantic Time, cruising at floor 330, the flight crew detected an odor in the cockpit and determined it to be smoke from the air conditioning system, a situation easily remedied by closing the air conditioning vent, which a flight attendant did on Zimmermann's request. 4 minutes later, the odor returned and now smoke was visible. The pilots began to consider diverting to a nearby airport for the purpose of a quick landing. At 22:14 AT, the flight crew made a pan-pan radio call to ATC Moncton, indicating that there was an urgent problem with the flight, but not an emergency which would imply immediate danger to the aircraft, and requested a diversion to Logan International Airport, Boston, which at the time was 300 nautical miles away. ATC Moncton offered the crew a vector to the closer Halifax International Airport in Enfield, Nova Scotia, 66 nm away, which Laparagraph W accepted. The crew then put on their oxygen masks and began their descent. Zimmermann put Laparagraph W in charge of the descent while he personally ran through the two Swissair standard checklists for smoke in the cockpit, a process that would take approximately 20 minutes and become a later source of controversy. At 22:18 AT, ATC Moncton handed over traffic control of the plane to Halifax Terminal Control Unit, a specialized ATC unit managing traffic in and out of Halifax. since the plane was now going to land there rather than continue on out of North American airspace. At 22:19 AT, the plane was 30 nautical miles away from Halifax International Airport, but Le Paragraphe W requested more time for the aircraft to descend from 21,000 feet. At 22:20 AT, Le Paragraphe W informed ATC Halifax that he needed to dump fuel. ATC Halifax subsequently diverted the plane towards St. Margarets Bay, where it could more safely dump fuel but still be only around 30 nautical miles from Halifax. In accordance with the Swissair checklist entitled "In case of smoke of unknown origin," the crew shut off the power supply in the cabin, which caused the recirculating fans in the ceiling to shut off. This caused a vacuum in the ceiling space above the passenger cabin which induced the fire to spread into the cockpit, causing the autopilot to shut down. At 22:24 and 28 seconds AT, Le Paragraphe W informed ATC Halifax that we now must fly manually. 17 seconds later, at 22:24 and 45 seconds AT, Le Paragraphe W informed ATC Halifax that Swissair 111 Heavy is declaring emergency, repeated the emergency declaration 1 second later, and over the next 10 seconds stated that they had descended to between 12,000 and 5,000 feet, and once more declared an emergency. The flight data recorder stopped recording at 22:25 and 40 seconds AT, followed 1 second later by the cockpit voice recorder. The plane briefly appeared again on radar screens from 22:25 and 50 seconds AT until 22:26 and 4 seconds AT. Its last recorded altitude was 9,700 feet. Shortly after the first emergency declaration, the captain could be heard leaving his seat to fight the fire, which was now spreading to the rear of the cockpit. The Swissair volume of checklists was later found fused together in the wreckage, indicating that the captain may have attempted to use them to fan back the flames. The captain did not return to his seat. Whether he was killed from the fire, asphyxiated by the smoke, or killed in the crash is not known. Physical evidence provides an indication that First Officer Le Paragraphe W may have survived the inferno only to die in the eventual crash. Instruments show that Le Paragraphe W continued trying to fly the now crippled aircraft, and gauges later indicated that he shut down Engine 2 due to an engine fire warning approximately 1 minute before impact, implying he was still alive and at the controls until the final moments of the flight. The aircraft struck the ocean at 22:31 AT at an estimated speed of 345 miles per hour and with a force of 350 g, causing the aircraft to disintegrate into millions of pieces. The crash location was approximately 44 degree 24 euro squared 33 euro cubed N 63 degree 58 euro squared 25 euro cubed W, with 300 meters uncertainty. Search and rescue operation. The search and rescue operation was codenamed Operation Persistence and was launched immediately by Joint Rescue Coordination Centre Halifax, which tasked the Canadian Forces Air Command, Maritime Command, and Land Force Command, as well as the Canadian Coast Guard and Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary Resources. The first rescue resources to approach the crash site were Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary Volunteer Units. These units were mostly privately owned fishing boats that departed from Peggys Cove, Bayswater, and other harbours on St. Margaret's Bay and the Asprotogan Peninsula. They were soon joined by the dedicated Canadian Coast Guard SAR vessels CCGS Sambro and CH-113 Labrador SAR helicopters flown by the 413 Squadron from CFB Greenwood. The crash site's proximity to Halifax meant that ships docked at Canada's largest naval base, CFB Halifax, as well as one of the largest Canadian Coast Guard bases, CCG Base Dartmouth, were within 1 hour's sailing time. Calls immediately went out and ships sailed as soon as possible for St. Margaret's Bay. The U.S. Navy also assisted in the recovery efforts. Canadian Coast Guard ships, CCGS Hudson, CCGS Mary Hickens, CCGS Simon Fraser, CCGS Earl Grey, CCGS Matthew, and CCGS Sambro. There were also several CCG helicopters, RHIBs, and auxiliary vessels which assisted. Canadian Forces warships, HMCSA Kingstoner, M700, HMCSA Preserver, AOR 510, HMCSA Vildequay Copyright Beaker, FFH 332, HMCSA Halifax, FFH 330, HMCSA Glasgow, 701, HMCSA Goosebayer, 707, HMCSA Moncton, 708, HMCSA Anticosta, MSA 110. There were also several CAF CH-124 Sea King anti-submarine warfare helicopters, as well as RCNA HIBs which assisted. Canadian Forces submarines, HMCSA Okanagan, S-74, Canadian Forces auxiliary vessels, CFAV Seashelt, CFAV Granby, CFAV Glenavise. HMCS Preserver was assigned as the on-scene commander of Operation Persistence and had authority over all aircraft and vessels within the area surrounding the crash site. Search and recovery operation. By the afternoon of September 3, it was apparent that there were no survivors from the crash and JRCC Halifax to task dedicated SAR assets. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were given overall command of the recovery operation, with HMCSA Preserver, AOR 510, remaining on-scene commander. The aircraft broke up on impact with the water and most of the debris sank to the ocean floor. Some debris was found floating in the crash area and over the following weeks debris washed up on the nearby shorelines. The initial focus of the recovery was on finding and identifying human remains and on recovering the flight recorders, but this proved difficult, as the force of impact was in the order of at least 350 g, and the environmental conditions only allowed the recovery of human remains along with the aircraft wreckage. Only one of the victims was visually identifiable. Eventually, 147 were identified by fingerprint, dental records, and X-ray comparisons. The remaining 81 were identified through DNA tests. With Canadian Forces divers, Navy clearance divers, port inspection divers, Ships Team divers, Army combat divers working on the recovery, a request was made by the Government of Canada to the Government of the United States for a larger dedicated salvage recovery vessel. The USAGRAP-E, ARS-53, was tasked to the recovery effort, arriving from Philadelphia on September 9. Among Grapple's crew were 32 salvage divers. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were found by the submarine HMCSA Okanagan, S-74, using sonar to detect the underwater locator beacon signals and were quickly retrieved by Canadian Navy divers. Both had stopped recording when the aircraft lost electrical power at approximately 10,000 AFT, 5 minutes and 37 seconds before impact. The recovery operation was guided by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada with resources from the Canadian Forces, Canadian Coast Guard, RCMP, and other agencies. The area was surveyed using route survey sonar, laser line scanners, and remotely operated vehicles to locate items. After being located, the debris was then recovered. On October 2, 1998, the TSB initiated a heavy lift operation to retrieve the major portion of the wreckage from the deep water before the expected winter storms began. By October 21, an estimated 27% of the wreckage was recovered. At that point in the investigation, the crash was generally believed to have been caused by faulty wiring in the cockpit after the entertainment system in the plane started to overheat. Certain groups issued aviation safety recommendations. The TSB released its preliminary report on August 30, 2000 and the final report in 2003. The final phase of wreckage recovery employed the ship Queen of the Netherlands to dredge the remaining aircraft debris. It concluded in December 1999 with 98% of the aircraft retrieved, approximately 126,554 kg of aircraft debris and 18,144 kg of cargo. Response to victims' families and friends. JFK Airport used the JFK Ramada Plaza to house relatives and friends of the victims of the crash, due to the hotel's central location relative to the airport. Due to its role in housing friends and relatives of several aircraft crashes, the hotel became known as the Heartbreak Hotel. Jerome Jerry Hauer, The head of the Emergency Management Task Force of Mayor of New York City Rudy Giuliani, praised the response of Swissair and codeshare partner Delta Airlines in responding to the accident. He had criticized Trans World Airlines and its response to the TWA Flight 800 crash in 1996. Victims: most of the passengers were American, French, or Swiss. 132 Americans, 41 Swiss, 30 French, 6 Britons, 3 Germans, 3 Italians, 3 Canadians, 2 Greeks, 2 Lebanese, 1 each from Afghanistan, China, India, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Spain, St. Kitts and Nevis, Sweden, and Yugoslavia, and 4 others were on board. Notable victims: several notable individuals died in this accident, including Pierce J. Geraghty, Jr., UNHCR Director of Operations for the Great Lakes region of Africa, who was on a special mission for UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to attempt to negotiate a peace accord with Laurent Kabila in an erupting regional war. Joseph LaMotta, son of former boxing world champion Jake LaMotta, Jonathan Mann, former head of the WHO's AIDS program, and his wife, AIDS researcher Mary Lou Clements Mann, European Synchrotron Radiation Facility physicist per Span, who had been working at Brookhaven National Laboratory since 1996, Professor Victor Rizza, Professor of Pharmacology, University of Catania, Italy. Pierre Babolat, head of Babolat. Identification: the Royal Canadian Mounted Police medical examiners identified most of the bodies within 10 weeks of the accident. Only one body was identifiable by sight. For approximately 100 bodies, the examiners used DNA. The DNA analysis has been referred to as the largest DNA identification project in Canadian history. About 90 bodies were identified by Canadian medical examiners using dental records. For around 30 bodies, examiners used fingerprints and ante-mortem X-rays. The large number of ante-mortem dental X-rays meant that around 90 bodies had been identified by the end of October. The RCMP contacted relatives of victims to ask for medical histories and dental records. Blood samples from relatives were used in the DNA identification of victims. Examination and investigation. An estimated 2 million pieces of debris were recovered and brought ashore for inspection at a secure handling facility in a marine industrial park at Sheet Harbour, where small material was hand-inspected by teams of RCMP officers looking for human remains, personal effects, and valuables from the aircraft's cargo hold. The material was then transported to CFB Shearwater, where it was assembled and inspected by over 350 investigators from multiple organizations, such as the TSB, NTSB, FAA, AAIB, Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, and Swissair. As each piece of wreckage was brought in, it was carefully cleaned with fresh water, sorted, and weighed. The item was then placed in a specific area of a hangar at CFB Shearwater, based on a grid system representing the various sections of the plane. All items not considered significant to the crash were stored with similar items in large boxes. When a box was full, it was weighed and moved to a custom-built temporary structure on a discontinued runway for long-term storage. If deemed significant to the investigation, the item was documented, photographed, and kept in the active examination hangar. Particular attention was paid to any item showing heat damage, burns, or other unusual marks. The lack of flight recorder data for the last 6 minutes of the flight added significant complexity to the investigation and was a major factor in its lengthy duration. The Transportation Safety Board team had to reconstruct the last 6 minutes of flight entirely from the physical evidence. As the aircraft was broken into 2 million pieces by the impact, this process was time-consuming and tedious. The investigation became the largest and most expensive transport accident investigation in Canadian history, costing $57 million Canadian dollars over 5 years. Cockpit and recordings: the front 10 am of the aircraft, from the front of the cockpit to near the front of the first-class passenger cabin, was reconstructed. Information gained by this allowed investigators to determine the severity and limits of the fire damage, its possible origins, and progression. The cockpit voice recorder used a 1/4-inch recording tape that operated on a 30-minute loop. It therefore only retained the half hour of the flight before the recorders failed, 6 minutes before the crash. The CVR recording and transcript are protected by a strict privilege under Section 28 of the Canadian Transportation Accident Investigation and Safety Board Act and thus have not been publicly disclosed. The air traffic control recordings are less strictly privileged. Section 29 of the same Act provides only that they may not be used in certain legal proceedings. The air traffic control transcripts were released within days of the crash in 1998 and the air traffic control audio was released in May 2007. Tsb Findings: the investigation identified 11 causes and contributing factors of the crash in its final report. The first and most important was aircraft certification standards for material flammability were inadequate and that they allowed the use of materials that could be ignited and sustain or propagate fire. Consequently, flammable material propagated a fire that started above the ceiling on the right side of the cockpit near the cockpit rear wall. The fire spread and intensified rapidly to the extent that it degraded aircraft systems and the cockpit environment, and ultimately led to the loss of control of the aircraft. Investigators identified evidence of arcing and wiring of the in-flight entertainment system network, but this did not trip the circuit breakers. The investigation was unable to confirm if this arc was the lead event that ignited the flammable covering on MPET insulation blankets that quickly spread across other flammable materials. The crew did not recognize that a fire had started and were not warned by instruments. Once they became aware of the fire, the uncertainty of the problem made it difficult to address. The rapid spread of the fire led to the failure of key display systems, and the crew was soon rendered unable to control the aircraft. Because he had no light by which to see his controls after the displays failed, the pilot was forced to steer the plane blindly. Intentionally or not, the plane swerved off course and headed back out into the Atlantic. Recovered fragments of the plane show that the heat inside the cockpit became so great that the ceiling started to melt. The recovered standby attitude indicator and airspeed indicators showed that the aircraft struck the water at 300 knots in a 20 degrees nose down and 110-degree bank attitude, or almost inverted. Death was instantaneous for all passengers and crew due to the impact forces and deceleration. The TSB concluded that even if the crew had been aware of the nature of the problem immediately after detection of the initial odor, and had commenced an approach as rapidly as possible, the developing fire-related conditions in the cockpit would have made a safe landing at Halifax impossible. Tsb Recommendations: the TSB made 9 recommendations relating to changes in aircraft materials, electrical systems, and flight data capture, as both flight recorders had stopped when they lost power 6 minutes before impact. General recommendations were also made regarding improvements in checklists and in fire detection and firefighting equipment and training. These recommendations have led to widespread changes in FAA standards, principally impacting wiring and fire hardening. 2011 speculation: in September 2011, the CBC program The Fifth Estate reported allegations suggesting that an incendiary device might have been the cause of the crash. These claims come from a former RCMP officer who claims that suspicious levels of magnesium and other elements associated with arson were discovered in the wiring and that he was ordered to remove references to magnesium or a suspected bomb from his investigative notes. The CBC later reported that the presence of magnesium could be explained by the long exposure of the wires to seawater, but that the levels discovered were higher than would normally be expected. Legacy: a memorial service was held in Tsar 1/4 Inch. The following year a memorial service was held in Nova Scotia. 2 memorials to those who died in the crash have been established by the Government of Nova Scotia. One is to the east of the crash site at the Halifax, a promontory 1 kilometre north of Peggys Cove. The second is a more private, but much larger commemoration located west of the crash site near Bayswater Beach Provincial Park on the Aswatagan Peninsula in Bayswater. Here, the unidentified remains of the victims are interred. A fund was established to fund maintenance of the memorials and the government passed an act to recognize them. Various other charitable funds were also created, including one in the name of a young victim from Louisiana, Robert Martin Maylett, which provides money for children in need. In September 1999, Swissair, Delta, and Boeing agreed to share liability for the accident and offered the families of the passengers financial compensation. The offer was rejected in favor of a $19.8 billion suit against Swissair and DuPont, the supplier of the Mylar insulation sheathing. A U.S. federal court dismissed the claim in February 2002. 2 paintings, including La Pinta by Pablo Picasso, were on board the aircraft and were destroyed in the accident. At the time of the accident, no other tri-jet airliner was in production aside from the McDonnell Douglas MD-11. Boeing, which had merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997, still produced the MD-11 as a freighter. The last passenger version was delivered in 1998 to Sabina. The last MD-11 overall was delivered to Lufthansa Cargo in 2001, as a freighter. After the crash, the flight route designator for Swissair's New York-Geneva route was changed to Flight 139, still using an MD-11. After Swissair's bankruptcy in 2002, the flight designator was changed again to Flight LX023, now operated by an Airbus A330-300. Since the crash, there have been many television documentaries on Flight 111, including the CBC's The Fifth Estate, The Investigation of Swissair 111, PBS's Nova Air Crash, and episodes of disaster shows like History Channel's Disasters of the Century, Discovery Channel's Mayday, and National Geographic Channel's Seconds from Disaster. Nova created a classroom activity kit for school teachers, using the crash as an example of an aircraft crash investigation. In May 2007, the TSB released copies of the audio recordings of the air traffic control transmissions associated with the flight. The transcripts of these recordings had been released in 1998, but the TSB had refused to release the audio on privacy grounds. The TSB argued that under Canada's Access to Information Act and Privacy Act, the audio recordings constituted personal information and were thus not disclosable. Canada's Federal Court of Appeal rejected this argument in 2006 in a legal proceeding concerned with air traffic control recordings in 4 other air accidents. The Supreme Court of Canada did not grant leave to appeal that decision, and consequently the TSB released a copy of the Swissair 111 air traffic control audio recordings to the Canadian press, which had requested the recordings under the Access to Information Act. Several key minutes of the air traffic control audio can be found on the Toronto Star website. The crash is referenced in the song TV on 10 by The Included, featured on their 2013 album Hockey Fright. See also, List of aircraft accidents, references. Further reading, Transportation Safety Board, in-flight fire leading to collision with water, Aviation Investigation Report, A98H0003AA Euro-French version available here, Butler, John Marshall. Forensic DNA Typing, Biology and Technology Behind STR Markers. Academic Press, San Diego. ISBN A0-12-147951 Exer, Kimber, Stephen. Flight 111, The Tragedy of the Swissair Crash. Seal Books, Toronto. ISBN A0-7704-2840-1. Wilkins, David. Murphy, Cecil. United by Tragedy, A Father's Story. Pacific Press Publishing Association. ISBN A0-8163-1980-4. External links, Transportation Safety Board of Canada, Final Report HTML, PDF, Final Report HTML, PDF. Detailed report about the crash on Austrian wings, Swissair Euro. Information about the accident of ESA 111 Euro. Swissair Flight 111 Euro. Memorial website, full coverage, World News: Swissair crash investigation Euro. Yahoo! News, planecrashinfo.com Euro. Swissair Flight 111 entry, The Investigation of Swissair 111. The Nature of Things. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Esquire. July 2000 report Euro. OE The Long Fall of 111 Heavier Euro. Highlighting the human side of the accident, Lloyd's of London, Lloyd's statement regarding Swissair crash site license application. Friday 19 May 2000. Lloyd's statement regarding the Swissair crash site. Tuesday 23 May 2000. Swissair Flight 111 a Euro Memorial, Bayswater, Nova Scotia.